There are moments in life when you are doing everything right. You are obeying God, you are following His instructions, you are walking in faith, and suddenly, you find yourself standing at the edge of an impossible situation with no way forward and danger closing in behind you. That is exactly where the Israelites stood at the Red Sea. And what God did next is the reason you need to watch this video all the way through. Because here is what nobody tells you. The Red Sea moment was not a mistake. It was not a detour. It was the plan. God deliberately led His people into a situation that looked like a death trap. And He did it because He wanted to show them something they could never have learned any other way. So if you are in a place right now where you cannot see the way forward, where the pressure is mounting on every side, where you have prayed and trusted and waited and still nothing seems to be moving, I need you to stay with me. Because the 25 lessons hidden in this one story might be the very thing that finally shifts how you see your situation, your faith, and the God who is with you right now. Before we get into the lessons, I want to be direct with you about something. By the time we finish today, two things are going to shift for you. The first is that you will finally understand why God led you into the situation you are in. Not the surface answer, but the real one. The one that makes sense of every impossible thing you have faced and every prayer that felt like it hit the ceiling. The second is that you will be able to see clearly that God is already working in your situation even though you cannot see it yet. And that second thing may be the thing you need most right now. But here is what I need you to hold in the back of your mind as we go through these lessons. There are 3 questions this story is going to answer, and I am not going to answer all of them right away. The first, why would a good God deliberately lead the people He loves into what looks like a death trap? The second, there is something God did the night before the miracle at the Red Sea that almost nobody ever talks about, and it may be the single most comforting thing in this entire account. And the third, Moses said one specific thing to the terrified Israelites that completely contradicts everything most people believe about how to pray when you are in crisis. I will get to all 3. But stay with me, because the answers build on each other. Before lesson 1, if you have ever felt like God was silent in a season where you needed Him most, or if you are in that season right now, please take a second and hit subscribe. Every week I put out content designed to meet you exactly where you are, in the hard moments, not just the good ones. Hit the like button if this is already speaking to something you are going through, and drop a comment below and tell me what your Red Sea looks like right now. I read every single one. Now let us get into the lessons. Lesson 1. God leads you into impossible situations on purpose. Exodus 13 verse 17 contains a detail that changes the entire way you should read this story, and the entire way you should read your own life. It says God did not lead Israel along the shorter, easier road through Philistine territory, even though that route was available. He deliberately chose the longer, harder path that ended at the edge of an uncrossable sea. And then, Exodus 14 verse 2 says, God specifically told Moses exactly where to set up camp, right by the water, hemmed in on every side. The location was not an accident, it was an instruction. This is the thing that has to land before any of the other lessons make sense. The Israelites did not wander into a dead end. They were led into one. By the same God who had just delivered them from Egypt with 10 dramatic plagues, the same God who was visible to them as a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. That God looked at the map, saw the sea, saw the mountains, saw the narrow place with no escape, and said, "Camp there." He did not choose the easier path for them because the easier path could not produce what He was after. So when you are sitting in your impossible situation right now, and I mean the specific one you carried into this video today, the question that deserves to replace, "Why is this happening to me?" is this: what is God building in me here that He could not build anywhere else? Because if God was willing to walk His own people into a geographic death trap to produce something in them, then your impossible situation is not evidence of His absence. It may be evidence of a very specific, very intentional plan, and that changes everything. That does not make it painless, but it changes what the pain is for. And knowing what the pain is for is the thing that makes it survivable. Lesson 2. The enemy will always come after what God has freed. Pharaoh released the Israelites. He watched the 10 plagues. He called Moses in the night. He told them to leave. And then Exodus 14 verse 5 says that when Pharaoh was told the people had fled, he and his officials had a change of heart. So he mobilized his army, his 600 best chariots, the finest in Egypt, and went after them. Here is the pattern you need to recognize, because it will happen to you too if it has not already. Whatever God frees you from will often come back at least once to see if it can reclaim what it lost. It does not come back weakened. It comes back organized, mobilized, and pursuing with everything it has. This is why people walk out of seasons of addiction and face a craving they have not felt in months at the exact moment they are most vulnerable. This is why people receive a financial breakthrough and an unexpected bill arrives 3 days later. This is why God opens a door and something immediately begins pushing against it from the other side. The enemy chases what God has delivered, and he always has. But what looks like a terrifying pursuit is not the same thing as winning. Pharaoh had 600 chariots. He still lost. The size of what is chasing you is not a measurement of the outcome. It is a measurement of what God is about to demonstrate on your behalf. Keep that in mind, because the next lesson is going to show you what happens in the camp when the army is coming and how God responds to it. Lesson 3. Fear is a legitimate response, but it cannot have the last word. When the Israelites looked up and saw Pharaoh's army bearing down on them, Exodus 14 verse 10 says they were terrified. The word the text uses is not mild unease. It is the fear of someone who genuinely believes they are about to die, and their first response was to cry out to the Lord. And their second response was to turn on Moses with one of the sharpest complaints in the entire Bible. They said it would have been better to stay as slaves in Egypt than to die in the wilderness. I want you to notice 2 things about this moment. The first is that God did not rebuke them for the fear. He did not pull back his presence. He did not say their faith was disqualified. He responded. The fear did not close the door on the miracle. The second thing is this. Their fear told the truth about something. It revealed that 400 years of slavery had shaped the way they thought about themselves and about what was possible. They genuinely believed the only options were death or going back. They could not conceive of a third option because the third option was a parted sea, and nobody in human history had ever seen that. When fear comes to you in an impossible situation, it is not evidence that your faith is broken. Fear is the honest acknowledgement that something is bigger than you. The real question is not whether you will feel it. The question is whether the fear gets to write the ending. Israel felt it, and the sea still split. Your fear does not disqualify your miracle. What would have disqualified it is if they had turned around and gone back. They were afraid, and they stayed. That is all God needed. Now, here is where it gets really interesting, because what Moses said next is one of the most misunderstood verses in this entire story. And I promised you at the beginning that it contradicts everything most people believe about how to pray in a crisis. You have seen 3 things so far: God's deliberate path into the impossible, the enemy's predictable pattern of pursuit, and the permission God gives for fear without withdrawing the miracle. But here is what most people who tell this story skip entirely. The answer God gave through Moses in that moment did not sound like a prayer strategy. It did not sound like warfare language. It sounded, honestly, like surrender. And yet it was the most powerful thing anyone could have said. That is lesson 4, and I'm going to show you exactly what Moses said and why it changes the way you approach every impossible situation for the rest of your life. Stay with me. Lesson 4. Stand still is the most radical act of trust God will ever ask of you. Moses turned to the terrified, complaining, grief-stricken crowd and said the words recorded in Exodus 14, verses 13 and 14. Don't be afraid. Just stand still and watch the Lord rescue you today. The Egyptians you see today will never be seen again. The Lord himself will fight for you. Just stay calm. Stand still. With 600 chariots coming, stand still. When everything in your body is screaming to run, to fight, to do something, anything at all to change the situation you are in, stay calm. This is why I said earlier that Moses said something that contradicts everything most people believe about praying in a crisis. Because most people believe that a strong prayer life in a crisis looks like aggressive, persistent wrestling with God prayer, and sometimes it does. But then God said something to Moses immediately after, in verse 15, that stopped me cold the first time I read it. He said, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the people to get moving." God essentially told Moses that the time for crying out had passed, the time for standing still in trust had arrived. And those are two different postures, and God knows which one a moment requires. The hardest part of standing still is not physical. It is the internal stillness, the refusal to catastrophize, to spiral into worst-case thinking, to let your imagination race ahead of God's provision. Because your mind, in a crisis, will try to solve a problem that is not yours to solve. Israel could not part the sea. There was no human action available to them that would have changed their situation. And God was asking them to stop burning energy trying to find one. He was asking them to hold their position, not because nothing was happening, but because the right thing was already happening behind the scenes. They just could not see it yet. Which brings me to the second thing I promised you at the beginning. The thing God did the night before the miracle that almost nobody ever talks about. Lesson 5. God is most active in the night you cannot see anything. This detail is easy to read past, but do not. Exodus 14 verse 19 says, "The angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's camp, moved and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them." And verse 20 says, "It brought darkness to the Egyptians, but lit up the night for Israel." So the Egyptians and Israelites did not come near each other all night long. All night. There was an entire night between the command to stand still and the parting of the sea. One full night where the water had not moved, where the army was still somewhere behind them in the dark, where every hour that passed must have felt like borrowed time, and the entire night God was moving. He repositioned his own presence, from leading them forward to shielding them from behind. He created a supernatural boundary that the Egyptian army could not cross. He was separating, positioning, protecting, all in the dark, all invisibly, all in a night that Israel experienced as waiting, but that God was using as preparation. This is the second thing I promised you at the beginning, because I want you to understand something about the season you are in right now. If you are in a night, if you are in the kind of waiting where nothing seems to be happening, where God seems quiet, where the miracle has not yet appeared, this passage says that the night is not empty. The cloud moved. God repositioned himself. He is doing things you cannot see, holding back what is trying to overwhelm you, separating what needs to be separated, creating boundaries around you that your enemy cannot cross. The night is not absence. The night is preparation. And it will not last forever. Morning is always coming, and what happens in the morning at the Red Sea is where the third open loop finally closes, in Lesson 6. Lesson 6. God parts the sea through ordinary obedience, not extraordinary ability. When morning came, God gave Moses the instruction. Exodus 14 verse 16, "Pick up your staff and raise your hand over the sea. Divide the water so the Israelites can walk through the middle of the sea on dry ground." Moses had a staff. He had already used it through the 10 plagues. It was a shepherd's tool, old, ordinary, wooden, and God told him to stretch it out over the water. That was the required action. Not a speech, not a military strategy, not a miraculous display of personal power. Stretch out the thing that is already in your hand. And verse 21 says, "Moses raised his hand, and the Lord opened up a path through the water with a strong east wind. The wind blew all night, the seabed went dry. The walls of water stood up on both sides, and the people walked through on dry ground." God did the miracle. Moses did the obedience. Those are two entirely different things, and they happened in that exact order. This principle, that God works through ordinary obedience with ordinary things already in hand, runs through the entire Bible. David had a sling. Elijah had a jar of oil. A widow in Zarephath had a handful of flour and a little olive oil. In every case, God did not wait for the person to have something spectacular before he moved. He asked for obedience with whatever was already there. If you are waiting for God to give you something extraordinary before you take the step He is asking you to take, you may be waiting for the wrong thing. The miracle is always His to produce. The obedience is yours to offer, and the obedience almost always comes first. The sea did not split, and then Moses stretched out his hand. Moses stretched out his hand, and then the sea split. Lesson 7. God fights differently than you expect, and more thoroughly than you can imagine. When the Egyptians entered the sea to pursue Israel, something strange happened. Exodus 14, verse 24 says, "The Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud and threw the Egyptian forces into confusion. He twisted their chariot wheels so they could barely move. And the Egyptians began to say, 'Let's get out of here. The Lord is fighting for Israel against Egypt.' They recognized it. In their panic, they understood what was happening, that they were not just losing a military engagement, they were fighting against a God who had turned their greatest strength into a liability. Their chariots, the most advanced military technology of their age, the thing that gave them overwhelming advantage in any open terrain, became useless the moment God touched them. Their power became their trap. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because God did not fight this battle the way any military general would have fought it. He did not send an overwhelming counterforce. He simply disabled what the enemy was relying on. He made the thing they trusted most become the thing that held them back. Whatever is being weaponized against you right now, whatever your enemy is counting on to overwhelm you, is not outside of God's reach. He has a way of turning the weapon into a liability. And when He does it, even the enemy recognizes what is happening. The Egyptians said it themselves. The Lord is fighting for Israel. He is fighting for you too. That brings us to the next lesson that will blow your mind. Lesson 8. God will make a way where there is literally no way. God will make a way is something Christians say so often it has almost lost its weight. We put it on mugs and print it on bookmarks and sing it at conferences. But at the Red Sea, it was not a metaphor or an inspirational sentiment. It was physics. The water divided. Exodus 14 verse 22 says the Israelites walked through the middle of the sea on dry ground, with walls of water on each side. Not ankle-deep water, not a fortunately shallow crossing. Walls of water and dry ground beneath their feet. Not mud, not sand you sink into. Dry. Every detail of this miracle was deliberate. The dryness of the ground was not incidental. It was God's way of saying that He does not just open the path, He also makes it walkable. He does not deliver you to the edge of the miracle and leave the rest to you. He prepares the conditions all the way through. This is the scale at which God operates when He moves. Not slightly better circumstances. Not a little more breathing room. A road through the sea. And the God who did this has not changed. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Which means the God who dried ground beneath the feet of terrified, complaining, faithless, recently freed slaves is the same God you are trusting right now in your impossible situation. And He has lost exactly none of His ability to do it again. Lesson 9. The same path that saves you will destroy what is pursuing you. This is one of the details in this story that I think deserves far more attention than it usually receives. Israel walked through the sea on dry ground. And then Pharaoh's army followed them in. Same path, same water, same corridor. But the outcome was completely different. Exodus 14, verse 28, says the waters rushed back and covered every chariot and horseman, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed Israel into the sea. Not one of them survived. The same Red Sea, two completely different outcomes depending on whose side you were on. What was salvation for Israel was destruction for Egypt. What opened for the delivered people became a grave for their pursuers. You do not have to turn around and fight what is chasing you. You do not have to defeat it yourself. God has a way of using the very thing He opens for your breakthrough as the place where what is pursuing you meets its end. Walk the path He opens. Trust the process He is running. What is behind you will be dealt with. Your job is not to face the army. Your job is to keep walking forward. Lesson 10. The crossing requires trust in the process, step by step. Walking between walls of water would have required a very specific kind of courage that is easy to overlook when you are reading the story from a distance. Every step forward was a step deeper into a corridor that, at any moment, could collapse. The walls were water. They were not stone. They were not permanent structures. They were held back by the power of God. And the only evidence that they would stay up long enough for the entire nation to cross was the fact that they were still standing right now. This is the nature of faith in the middle of a miracle. God opens the path and then asks you to walk it, all the way through, not stopping halfway because the walls look unstable, not turning back because you are afraid of what is behind you. Trust in process means trusting that what God opened, He will hold open, for exactly as long as you need to get to the other side. The miracle is not just in the opening, it is also in the sustaining. God did not part the sea and then leave it to the laws of physics. He held it. Every step of the way, He held it. And He will hold what He has opened for you too, long enough for you to get all the way through. Now, we have seen why God leads you into the impossible, how the enemy responds, what the night before the miracle really means, and what happens when ordinary obedience meets divine power. But here is what I have not told you yet. After the crossing, after the water came back, after the army was gone, after it was over, Israel did something that completely changed how God would work with them for the rest of their journey. And then, 3 days later, they did something else entirely that should terrify every person watching this video about their own faith. Because the same thing they did 3 days after the miracle is the thing that quietly undermines most believers' faith today, and most people never realize it is happening. Keep watching. Lesson 11. After the miracle, worship before you do anything else. When the sea had closed and the army was gone and the threat was over, the very first thing recorded in Scripture is not logistics. It is not planning. It is not relief or celebration or debriefing. Exodus 15 verse 1 says Moses and the Israelites sang a song to the Lord. They stopped right there on the shore of the sea and they worshipped. The women joined with tambourines. Miriam led the entire congregation in praise. It went on for a long time. Exodus 15 is one of the most extended worship passages in the entire Torah. This was not incidental. They were embedding the miracle into their identity through worship. Every word they sang was a specific naming of what God had done. His right hand is glorious in power. He hurled the enemy into the sea. He is my strength. He is my song. They were not just expressing emotion. They were building a record. They were creating something to return to when the next impossible situation appeared. Because gratitude that is named and worshipped becomes the foundation of the faith that carries you forward. If you receive a miracle and immediately pivot to the next problem, you lose the depth of what God just gave you. The miracle was not just for the moment. It was meant to become a memory you could stand on for the rest of your life. Stop long enough to worship, name what He did, specifically and out loud. That is not just devotion. It is preparation for what comes next. Lesson 12. Your miracle carries a message further than you will ever know. Moses sang something in Exodus 15, verses 14 through 16 that sounds almost prophetic, because it was. He sang about the nations, hearing what God had done. He sang that the Philistines would tremble, that the leaders of Edom would be overcome with terror, that the people of Canaan would melt in fear. He sang this while still standing on the edge of the Red Sea, before any of those nations had even heard the news. 40 years later, when 2 Israelite spies slipped into Jericho and hid in the house of a woman named Rahab, she told them exactly this, that news of the Red Sea had reached Jericho. that the people's hearts had melted in fear, that everyone in the city knew what had happened. Moses' song had been accurate. The miracle traveled. The testimony reached places Israel had not yet gone. Your breakthrough is not just for you. The impossible thing God comes through on in your life, the Red Sea He parts, carries a testimony that travels further than you will ever be able to track. People around you, people watching you go through this, people who do not know God yet, are reading your story. They are watching to see what God does with someone who trusts Him in the impossible. Your miracle will be someone else's reason to believe. Lesson 13. God's timing is exact, even when it feels unbearably late. The Israelites had been in slavery for 400 years before a single plague fell on Egypt. 400 years. Then there were 10 plagues over an extended period before the Exodus finally came. And even after they left, they wandered to the edge of an uncrossable sea before the final deliverance happened. Every stage in this account came after waiting that, from inside it, must have felt like abandonment. But in God's economy, the timing of the Red Sea miracle was precise. It was the moment Pharaoh's pride had reached its fullest, most dangerous expression. It was the moment Israel had genuinely run out of options. It was the moment the miracle would be seen by the largest number of nations and remembered for the longest span of history. Too soon, and the lesson would have been incomplete. Too late, and the army would have overtaken them. God's timing is not arbitrary. It is always calculated around purposes that are larger than the single moment you are inside. If you are feeling like God is late, and I know some of you feel that deeply right now, consider that you may be standing at the edge of the sea and the parting is closer than you think. Lesson 14. Impossible situations reveal what is actually living in your heart. The Israelites' response at the sea, the fear, the complaints against Moses, the longing to go back to Egypt, revealed something that the Exodus itself had not yet changed. Physically, they were free, but internally, they still thought like slaves. They still believed that the options available to them were limited to the options available in Egypt. They could not imagine a third way because they had not yet been taught to think with the mind of people who had a God who parts seas. Impossible situations are diagnostic. When the pressure is high enough, what comes out is what was already inside, not what you hoped was there, what is actually there. The complaints of Israel at the sea showed where healing still needed to happen, where trust had not yet gone deep enough to hold under pressure. And God already knew all of it. He was not surprised by any of it. The impossible moment just made it visible, to them and to us. When an impossible situation surfaces, fear or bitterness or the urge to go back to what is familiar and safe, do not be ashamed of it. Be honest about it. Bring what you find to God. Let the moment teach you what still needs to be surrendered. The diagnosis is not the verdict. It is the beginning of the treatment. Lesson 15. God's glory is the deepest reason behind the hardest moments. Here is where the first open loop from the beginning of this video finally closes completely. I asked you to hold this question: why would a good God deliberately lead His people into what looks like a death trap? And here is the answer, stated by God Himself before the miracle happened. Exodus 14, verse 4. I will use Pharaoh's stubbornness to make me look glorious over Pharaoh and his army. And then, verse 17. I will receive great glory at the expense of Pharaoh and his army, his chariots and his charioteers. God said it plainly. The purpose of the Red Sea moment was His glory. Israel's salvation was real and deeply desired by God, but the entire architecture of the moment was designed to display who He is to the widest possible audience. He chose the narrow place, the sea, the impossible geography, because He wanted there to be absolutely no other explanation for what happened except Him. No general could take credit. No military strategy could account for it. There was only one explanation available: God. The same is true of your impossible situation. If there were an easier way for God to accomplish what He is after, He might have taken it. But He has placed you in a situation where, when He moves, there will be no other explanation available. The breakthrough that is coming in your life, the one you are still waiting for, is being designed to make God undeniably visible. Not just to you, to everyone watching your life. Your impossible place is a stage, and God is about to perform something on it that will leave no room for doubt about who He is. 15 lessons. You now understand why God led you into the impossible, what He is doing in the night you cannot see, and why His glory is the deepest purpose behind your hardest moment. But what comes next takes us somewhere most people never go when they read the Red Sea story. Because the Apostle Paul looked at this crossing and said something about it in the New Testament that completely reframes what the Red Sea means for your life today. And then, 3 days after the miracle, 3 days, Israel did something that should shake every person watching this video to the core. Because it is probably something you are doing too. I will get there. Keep watching. Lesson 16. The Red Sea was a baptism. You are being changed at the level of identity. The Apostle Paul drew a line between the Red Sea and the New Testament that reframes everything. In 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 through 2, he writes that the Israelites were all baptized as followers of Moses in the cloud and in the sea. He called the Red Sea crossing a baptism, and that word carries everything. Baptism in the New Testament represents death to one life and resurrection into another. To go under the water, or, in Israel's case, to walk through it with walls of water rising on both sides, and come out the other side, is to be changed at the level of identity. You are not the same person you were before you went in. Israel entered the sea as runaway slaves, with 400 years of bondage in their bones. They came out on the other side as a delivered nation walking toward a promised land. The crossing itself was the transformation. Your impossible situation may be functioning as a threshold. You are not meant to come out of it the same person you were when you went in. The trial is not just something to endure and then resume your normal life afterward. It is forming you into someone with a different kind of faith. A faith that has actually been through something. A faith that has stood at the edge of the sea and stayed. A faith that knows what God looks like when He moves in impossibility. The person on the other side of your Red Sea will not be who you are today, and that is entirely the point. Lesson 17. What God closes behind you, He closes completely. When Israel emerged on the other side of the sea, the water returned completely. Exodus 14, verse 28, says it covered every chariot, every horseman, every soldier who had entered that sea. Not one of them survived. There was no residual pursuit. The enemy did not regroup and follow them into the wilderness from that direction. The sea closed, and what it closed was final. When God brings you through a Red Sea, pay close attention to what does not follow you. Some things that were pressing against you in the old season simply cannot enter the new one. They do not have permission. They were destroyed at the crossing. There are chapters God closes so completely that what was chasing you has no way to pursue. This is not true of every challenge. The wilderness had its own struggles, and we will get there. But the specific enemy that was destroyed at the sea never troubled Israel from that direction again. Recognize the finality of what God closes. Do not spend energy watching for an enemy that is already at the bottom of the sea. Your job is to keep walking forward. God handled what was behind you. Lesson 18. Waiting is not inactivity. It is the hardest form of obedience. The night before the miracle, Israel stood still, not because nothing mattered, not because they had stopped caring about the army behind them, but because standing still was the specific act of obedience God required in that moment. Every hour they stood must have felt like a waste of time. Every hour was probably being argued against by at least someone in the camp, someone insisting they had to move, had to act, had to do something. Waiting on God is consistently underestimated as a spiritual discipline because it looks from the outside like inactivity. But to remain in the place where God led you, doing the last thing He told you to do, without running ahead and without retreating, that requires more sustained obedience than most action does. Action releases the tension, waiting holds it. And holding tension in trust, without collapse, is exactly the kind of character that God was building in Israel and that He builds in everyone. He is preparing for something significant. The waiting is not the delay before the real work begins. The waiting is part of the real work. What you become in the waiting is often more important than what you receive at the end of it. Lesson 19. God remembers His promises even when you feel completely forgotten. The entire Red Sea story is grounded in a covenant that was 400 years old. Exodus 2, verse 24 says, God heard the groaning of the Israelites and remembered His covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That covenant, the promise that they would be His people, that He would bring them to a land, was the engine behind every plague, every miracle, the parting of the sea itself. God was not responding to their performance. He was honoring a promise He made to their ancestors before any of them were born. When you feel forgotten, when your prayers feel like they are going nowhere, when the silence is long, when the situation shows no sign of changing, the Red Sea story is a reminder that God's faithfulness does not depend on whether you can feel it. He did not forget Abraham's descendants through 400 years of brutal slavery. He will not forget you in your season of waiting. His silence is not absence. It is the quiet faithfulness of a God who is working on a timescale that is larger than any single chapter of your life. The promise He made over you is still in effect. The covenant is still active. And when His timing is right, He will move. Not because you finally prayed hard enough, but because He keeps His word. Lesson 20. What God does for you, He does all the way through. The miracle at the Red Sea did not stop partway. The path did not open for the front of the group and then close before the children and the elderly and the livestock could cross. The walls of water did not hold for an hour and then collapse in the middle of the crossing. Every single Israelite, every man, woman, child, and animal made it through, completely. And on the other side, the enemy was not weakened or slowed down, it was destroyed. When God moves in your situation, He moves thoroughly. This does not mean every breakthrough arrives all at once. God often works in seasons, and gradual breakthrough is real and valid. But when God brings you through, He brings you all the way through. He does not deliver you halfway and then leave you to complete the crossing on your own. What He opens, He holds. What He promises, He finishes. You will not arrive at the other side of your Red Sea and find that God stopped halfway and left a section incomplete. He is not a halfway God. He finishes what He starts. And He started something in you long before you arrived at the edge of this sea. 20 lessons, 5 left. And I told you at lesson 11 that Israel did something 3 days after the miracle that should shake you to the core. I have been building toward it because you need the weight of everything that just happened. The night season, the parting, the army destroyed, the worship on the shore. You need all of that in your mind before you hear what they did 3 days later. Because when you hear it, the application to your own life is going to be uncomfortably clear. And the final lesson, lesson 25, is the one that ties everything together in a way that I believe will permanently change how you read every impossible situation in your life. Do not stop now. Lesson 21. Your testimony is a weapon. Build it specifically and guard it fiercely. After the crossing, Israel did not just feel grateful. They sang. And the song in Exodus 15 is remarkably specific. It names what God did with precise, concrete detail. His right hand is glorious in power. He hurled the enemy into the sea. His fury blazed like fire. He blew with His breath, and the sea covered them. Every line was a named, specific act of God, committed to memory through song. Revelation 12, verse 11 says, Believers overcame the enemy by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. Testimony is not just an encouragement tool for other people. It is a weapon in your own spiritual arsenal, but only if it is specific. A vague sense that God has been good to you will not sustain you when the next Red Sea appears. But a specific memory. In March of that year, when I had nothing left, God did this exact thing. That specific record becomes something you can stand on when your emotions are telling you that God has never come through and never will. Start keeping a written record. Specific dates, specific situations, specific breakthroughs. The Red Sea you have already crossed is the evidence that will carry your faith through the edge of the next one. Lesson 22. The fear of the Lord produced at the Red Sea is the foundation of everything that follows. Exodus 14, verse 31 says that when Israel saw the mighty power the Lord had unleashed against the Egyptians, they were filled with awe. They feared the Lord. And then, only then, they put their faith in him and in his servant Moses. The faith came after the awe. The trust was built on the foundation of reverence. We have largely lost this in the way we talk about God in Western Christianity. We talk about him as though he is primarily a comfort source, a prayer answering machine, a loving presence that mostly agrees with us and exists to make our lives better. And he is loving, profoundly and tenaciously loving. But the God of the Red Sea is also the God who drowned an army in 3 minutes. He is loving and he is holy, and he is powerful in ways that should produce in us a reverence that shapes everything about how we approach him, how we pray, how we live. The fear of the Lord is not terror. It is the settled, sober recognition that you are dealing with someone who is not manageable, and that this is exactly why you can trust him. A God who is safe enough to control is not powerful enough to save you. Lesson 23. Forgetting what God has done is the most dangerous thing you will ever do. Here it is, the thing I have been building toward since lesson 11. Exodus 15, verse 27 says, "After the crossing and the worship, Israel came to Elim, a beautiful place with 12 springs and 70 palm trees. They camped there. And then, 3 days later, 3 days after walking through the parted sea, 3 days after watching God destroy the most powerful military force in the known world," Exodus 15, verse 24 says the people complained against Moses. "What are we going to drink? The water at Marah was bitter." 3 days, the miracle that should have sustained their faith for years, lasted 3 days before it was functionally invisible to them, crowded out by the next discomfort. I want to ask you something honest. How long do your miracles last in your memory before they are crowded out by the next problem? Because this is not just an Israelite failure, this is a human failure, and it is happening in your life right now. The breakthrough God gave you last year, the one that felt so significant when it happened, is it still informing how you are approaching your current impossible situation? Or has the current problem made it feel distant and irrelevant? This is why testimony is not optional. This is why the discipline of remembrance is commanded throughout Scripture, not suggested, commanded. Your heart will forget by default. The miracle will be reduced to a vague memory within weeks if you do not actively, intentionally, repeatedly return to it. Do not let your Red Sea fade. It is the evidence God gave you to carry forward. Protect it. Lesson 24. The crossing was always about Canaan. Your trial is always about the promise. The Red Sea was not the destination. The miracle was not the end of the story. It was the entry point into a journey that was always meant to end at a promised land. Every lesson learned in the wilderness, every Red Sea moment, every stretch of trusting and waiting and sometimes complaining and returning, all of it was preparation for what God had promised from the beginning. Your impossible situation is not the destination either. God did not bring you to the edge of this sea just to part it and then leave you standing on the other side with nothing to walk toward. The crossing is serving the promise. The trial is building the capacity to receive and steward what he has prepared. If God had simply removed every obstacle the moment it appeared, Israel would have arrived in Canaan without the faith required to take it. The Red Sea, the wilderness, the manna, the water from the rock, all of it was forming in them the kind of people who could actually possess and live in a promised land. Your impossible situation is forming in you the kind of person who can carry what God has promised. Do not just endure it, let it do its work. Lesson 25. The Red Sea is always pointing to the cross, and that is why it never loses its power. This is where everything lands. This is the lesson that all 24 have been building toward, the truth that makes sense of every other truth in this story. The Red Sea is not ultimately about Moses. It is not ultimately about Israel. And with all the personal application we have walked through today, it is not ultimately about you either. It is about Jesus. And Paul told us this directly. Israel's story is written for our instruction as a picture of what was coming. At the Red Sea, God opened a path through death so his people could walk into life. On the cross, Jesus opened a path through death, his own death, so that every person who trusts in him can walk out of condemnation and into life that does not end. The walls of water that stood on both sides of Israel were death, held back by the power of God, long enough for his people to cross safely. The cross is God holding back the power of sin and death permanently, completely, finally, so that you can cross from where you are to where he is calling you. The enemy that pursued Israel was destroyed in the sea. The enemy that pursues you, sin, the weight of everything you have done and everything done to you, the condemnation that says you are too far gone, too broken, too late, was destroyed at the cross. Not weakened, not delayed, destroyed. Romans 8 verse 1 says, "There is no condemnation for those who belong to Christ Jesus, none. The army is at the bottom of the sea." And just as not one Israelite was left behind in that water, not one person who trusts in Christ is left behind in their condemnation. The same God who said, "Stand still and watch," to a terrified nation at the edge of an impossible sea, said it is finished from a cross, and meant both with equal certainty. Every Red Sea you face in your life is a shadow of the greater crossing that Christ already made for you, which means you are never facing your impossible situations alone or unaided. You are facing them as someone who has already been brought through the ultimate Red Sea, the one that no human effort could ever have crossed. And the God who parted that sea is the same God standing with you at the edge of yours right now. 25 lessons from one story. And every single one of them has said the same thing from a different angle. God is not surprised by where you are. He is not absent from what you are feeling. He led you here deliberately. He is working in the night you cannot see, and he has every intention of bringing you all the way through. The Red Sea did not break the Israelites. It revealed their God. And your impossible situation, the one that brought you to this video today, is not going to break you either. It is going to reveal the same God to you and through you in a way that you will carry for the rest of your life. So let me ask you something before you close this video. Which of these 25 lessons landed on something specific in your life today? Name it in the comments below. Tell me what your Red Sea looks like. Tell me which lesson you needed most. I read every single comment, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in an impossible season is name it out loud to someone who is going to pray with you and believe with you that the sea is about to part. If this video helped you, please share it with someone who is standing at their own edge right now. They may not know how to find words for what they are going through, but this might be exactly what they need to hear today. Hit the like button if you are leaving here with more faith than you arrived with. And if you are not subscribed yet, do that now, because next week we are going into the wilderness journey that followed the Red Sea, and the lessons there are just as powerful, just as personal, and in some ways even harder, because they are about what happens to your faith when the miracle is behind you and the next one has not arrived yet. God is not finished with your story. The sea is about to move.